Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Rob Harrell, Pastor Emeritus, Austin Oaks Church, and founder and president of Austin Global Ambassadors. And it's our joy to welcome you tonight to a very significant dialogue between two wonderful spokesmen from two different worldviews. I want to introduce you to our speakers tonight. First of all, I want to tell you a little bit about Matt Dillahunty. Matt is the president, or I should say public speaker, avid gamer, magician, and internet personality. Some of you might recognize him. He is the president of the Atheist community of Austin from 2006 to 2013. For many years, he's hosted the Austin-based webcast and cable access television show, The Atheist Experience, since 2005. And I told him at dinner tonight I had anonymously called in a couple times as well. He was nice to me. Interestingly enough about Matt, he was a Southern Baptist for more than 25 years and sought to become a minister, actually, until his investigation of his religious views led him to reject supernatural claims. He now identifies himself as a skeptic, humanist, and atheist. He's the creator of the Atheist Debates Patreon project, which is dedicated to providing the understanding and tools for more effective discussions between theist and atheist. Regularly engages in formal debates and travels the world speaking to secular organizations, churches, and university groups on religion, philosophy, skepticism, and atheism, humanism, and magic. Welcome, Matt. We're so glad you're here tonight.
I'm very glad to be here. Thank you very much. I like that intro. It sounds like I know a lot more than I actually do.
Yeah, I don't know who wrote it. But
I did.
Yeah, okay. So our second guest tonight is Michael Suderman, and he's a speaker based in Washington, D.C. for the Ravi Zacharias International Ministries group, which aims to help thinkers believe and believers to think. Graduated from Tabor College in 2011 with degrees in philosophy and religious studies before heading to the University of Oxford for graduate study in theology alongside 2 years of study at the Oxford Center for Christian Apologetics. Prior to his work as a speaker with RZIM, Michael lived in India, where he pioneered and helped develop a study abroad program for U.S. university students. Something that's really important, though, is that Michael grew up in Kansas, has two brothers, one of which is his fraternal twin. So maybe at the midpoint, we might exchange him for his brother. We'll see. In his spare time, Michael enjoys playing flag football and seeking out good barbecue restaurants. So you've come to the right place,
I have
Michael.
indeed, yes.
Welcome.
Thank you for having
Let's
me.
welcome Michael.
Yeah. I hope so.
Now, this is a wonderful gathering tonight, and I just want to tell you, this is part of a larger week we're calling RZIM, Ravi Zacharias International Ministries ThinkWeek. And we would like to recommend that you go on to the website, ThinkWeekAustin and .org and .com, and see what other things will be happening this week. So this is just one of those events, but we think this is the place to be tonight. We're so glad that you came. Now, I want to just say a couple things about the spirit of our dialogue tonight, and that's what we want it to be, really. It's a dialogue more than a debate. We really want to discuss issues. Both Matt and Michael are really good at that. It is not our desire to get personal or to call people names, but really to help you all understand different worldviews and even where these two are coming from, so that you can listen to understand. Now, the format tonight is going to be basically this. we're going to ask a question of each of the guys tonight, and each one will be able to answer in about 5 minutes. And you're going to hear a lot in 5 minutes, so take your pencils out and your notepads. We want you to take down as much as you can. Because after their time of addressing issues, we're going to have a longer time of Q&A from the floor. And we'll set up a microphone here after these fellows have had a chance to address some basic questions, and be thinking of the kinds of questions you want to ask of these two. Now, Michael, of course, is coming from a Christian worldview. Matt's coming from an atheistic worldview. And we want you to know we had a pleasant dinner tonight. We know this is going to be a lot of fun and very educational. These are two wonderful guys, and I'm so glad they came. So I wanted to jump right into it to show you, let me say better, so you can get to know these guys. And guys, these are very brief questions, okay? Very brief. So if you could only eat one food every day for the rest of your life, what would it be? Quickly.
Well, you already have my answer to that. That would be barbecue ribs.
Mine starts with a B too. Baklava.
Okay. All right. Android or iPhone?
Android.
iPhone.
Okay.
I'm done.
Favorite holiday?
Christmas.
I knew you'd say that.
I watch the Polar Express every year at Christmas.
Isn't that great? You already
Yeah.
agree on something. I love it. Coke or Dr. Pepper?
Coke Zero.
Diet Coke. We're very nuanced.
Is the glass half empty or half full?
Both.
Neither.
You sleep on your back, your side, or your stomach?
I'll sleep when I'm dead. Side mostly, I guess.
Favorite super... Oh, you didn't say, Michael.
No, I toss and turn. I don't know. Probably all of them.
All right. Favorite superhero?
Batman. No. Yeah. Well, whatever.
Oh, Spider-Man.
All right.
Yeah.
Very good. Favorite dessert?
Baklava.
Mine would be homemade vanilla ice cream.
Cats or dogs?
See, I was a dog person, and then I became a cat person, and dogs.
I'm one of those deprived Americans who has never had a dog. I have only had cats, and in the last 2 years have become a dog person.
All right. Paper or plastic?
For what? Paper. No plastic.
It's not a very Austin answer, but plastic.
All
Sorry.
right. Name a favorite book.
Innumeracy.
Wow. A favorite book. Okay.
You want a hint?
I almost said it. That's 66 books, Matt.
Yes. In your version.
I'm trying to think of it. A favorite book, Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
Okay. Trump or Hillary? Never mind.
I was going to say.
Never mind. Tucked in or untucked?
Tucked in now.
Untucked.
And your favorite kind of music?
Good music.
Blues rock, unparalleled.
Okay. So you guys do agree on some things already, and there might be some things you disagree on, have a different perspective of, and so I want to get to some questions tonight, and again, to remind you, there'll be a time for you to ask questions too, so be listening well and be prepared to come to the mic in a few moments. So we want to begin with Matt, and this is kind of a backwards way of saying something, but something I think is important. Matt, when we think about this, what is one common misconception, I'm sorry, Matt, we'll go with Matt first. What is one common misconception Christians have of atheists?
Yeah, so a lot of times I don't want to know the questions in advance for these things, but this time I actually looked at the questions ahead of time, and I actually posted a video, which is live now, with my thoughts about how I might answer some of these, just so I can kind of go back and look to see what changed, because I spent a lot of time thinking about this. It's really difficult to come up with one, because what most Christians know about atheists has not come from atheists. This sort of privileged position that religion has had in culture means that, when I was a kid, the only thing I learned about atheists came from the church or from my mom, and so there was a certain perspective there. It's not like I ever met or talked to an atheist. And so I started thinking, and I was like, well, I know that there are some who think that I'm a devil worshiper, or that I've never heard the gospel, despite the fact that we have studies that show that atheists, on average, probably know more about religion and the Bible and things like that than the average believer does. Maybe something bad happened to me, that I had a bad experience in a church. That's a common one. Maybe I just went to the wrong church. People would ask me, hey, what's your background? Oh, you're Southern Baptist? Oh, that's the problem. You were Southern Baptist. If you'd have been Lutheran, Episcopalian, Catholic, whatever else, that would have fixed it. You were just in a flawed church. But I think that a lot of these tie down to a common theme, and I'm not saying this is a universal misconception, but I am constantly accused of secretly believing that a God exists, and it comes in a number of different forms. There was a gentleman who called into the show just yesterday to tell me that I do in fact believe, and we had a conversation about whether it's possible to believe something and not be aware of it. We didn't really come to terms on that. I did a debate with Cy ten Bruggencate, and as a presuppositionalist, his assertion is that I not only believe that God exists, but I know that God exists. He comes at it from the standpoint of this is a necessary component from a foundation of logic. Somebody else might come to it because of Romans 1:20, that I'm without excuse, or any number of other verses that affirm what Christians already believe. And I was guilty of this too. First of all, I didn't know what an atheist was. I was out witnessing to non-believers and had no idea I was talking to atheists. And in some cases I wasn't. In some cases they had some abstract deistic notion. But I think the best way to address this is, if you're a Christian and you're listening to this, imagine what you would take away from a conversation where I told you, you don't really believe in Jesus. You don't. This is just a cultural thing. It's the way you were raised. You believe in belief. You're just going through the motions. You see some value in this thing. You think maybe there's some moral foundation, or that this makes society better, or everybody around you believes, or it's just comfortable, but you don't actually believe. How would you feel? Well, I know that when I was a believer, if somebody said that to me, I would instantly know that they don't have the first clue about what I believe, and that they probably don't care, that they're more interested in letting me know how right they are. And there was a debate I did in Canada where I was accused by a minister that God will reveal himself to anybody if you just do it right, and I must have done it wrong. And what he didn't realize is that this is essentially a statement from him that he has a belief and he cannot be wrong about it, which means that if I don't fit into his belief, I'm the one that's wrong. And when Christians come to atheists and say, you secretly believe, or you believe and you're not aware, all we hear is, wow, you really have never had a conversation with somebody who doesn't believe. You are so convinced, and I understand that you are convinced. I understand if you believe in God and you believe in the Bible and you accept that Romans 1:20 says I'm without excuse, that God's written his code on everybody's heart, that the invisible things of his work are evident to everybody, then it's preposterous for you to accept that I don't actually believe. And I get that. It's difficult. But if you can step out of that a little bit and recognize that at some point you didn't believe, you may not remember it, you may have been very young, but you became convinced. Beliefs are the result of becoming convinced. And I think that the common misconception or one of the many misconceptions Christians might have about atheists, is that we're not really atheists. Or you play with the definition to say, well, you're not absolutely certain there isn't a God. No, and that has nothing to do with the definition of atheist. It just means I'm not convinced there's a God. I honestly can tell you I'm not convinced that there's a God. In many cases, I'm convinced there's not a God. You are not a mind reader. I am. I do this on stage. I fake it, as I think everybody does. But I always think it's a mistake for believers and non-believers, for anybody in any situation, to portray their position as if they are able to read your mind, as if they know what your motivations are. This comes up all the time in discussions. And so the notion that I'm somehow a secret believer or I believe that I'm unaware really stalls every potential conversation that might get us to a point where we could understand that, hey, it's just as weird for me to live in a world where a whole bunch of people are convinced of something that I don't see sufficient evidence to warrant belief, as it is for you to think that it's just obvious that a God exists, and how could somebody be such an obstinate fool as to proudly sit on stage and talk about how they don't believe? When we recognize that that weirdness exists for both of us, then I think we can kind of move past that for conversation.
I appreciate that, Matt. Thanks. So, Michael, this question, kind of in the reverse, is for you. What's one common misconception you believe atheists have about Christians?
I do think that there are some misconceptions. I will say that I would consider myself fortunate to have had an opportunity to talk to people of many different worldviews, atheism being one of them, and that in large part those conversations have been very productive with people who have a high regard for understanding what's true. But if there's anything, it may be actually that for those of you here who are Christians as well, that as Christians we have done ourselves a bit of a disservice in not being very intentional in coming to understand some of the definitions of the words that we use and things like that, using them interchangeably with some other things. One example, for example, that's a bit redundant, but one example would be, I think there is a quite common confusion about what faith means, what it means to be a person of faith. Some conflation of belief with an active aspect of that's involved in an active definition of faith, which is to trust or fully invest in or commit your life to. And you obviously have to believe in something to trust something, but I think as Christians we talk about losing faith, but what we mean is losing belief. And we talk about having faith, and we don't mean about having belief, we mean having trust in a particular circumstance. And so I think there are some times where in conversations with atheists, people have pushed back at me and said, well, really, ultimately, you just believe where there is no evidence. Or actually, you believe where there exists evidence to the contrary. And that kind of blind belief is never something that I could, not a delusion that I could step into. And I'm actually, some people will even say something along the lines of, I'm actually baffled and kind of impressed that you can do that and you can somehow convince yourself of these things, but I just don't have the capacities to do it. And I think that, unfortunately, because there's been a lack of understanding of what faith actually is, that it's a function of trust in a person and has to do with a full commitment of your life on the basis of someone who has proven them morally worthy of that trust, in the same sense that you have faith in other kinds of relationships. I think that may be part of it, but the biggest misconception by far is that if to be a Christian you have to check your brain at the door of the church and walk in and not be a critical thinker, or not be somebody who wants to have a high value for rational conversations, or somebody who isn't willing to look at the Bible with a critical lens and really wrestle with difficult texts and acknowledge the texts that are difficult. I think sometimes there's this misconception of Christians as people who give the Bible a free pass in every instance. And the case is that does happen, but it's not a wholesale example of what it means to be a Christian. I think there are plenty of examples in the Bible of people who think critically, are engaging in their context, are engaging with the relevant philosophical ideas in their context. Paul is a very clear example of that. And so that would be maybe the number one misconception that I can think of.
So on this first two questions, you all wanted to just be able to respond to the other on this first one. Matt, you're saying that you don't want Christians to read your mind and tell you what you really do believe. And Michael, you're saying that there's a misunderstanding of what faith is and this whole idea of checking your brains at the door as a Christian. So why don't you respond to those two misconceptions for just a moment? Why don't you, Michael, first respond to what Matt said about this idea of mind reading. Here's what you really do believe.
Right. I actually didn't expect that. That was a different response than I thought maybe you would give, because I think at least in most cases, I'm sure you have experienced that, and I don't want to undermine that in that type of interaction. I do my very best to acknowledge if people say they believe something, then unless I have reason to think they don't, then I probably won't accuse them of believing something else. But I think that Christians do have certain misconceptions of atheists. I think sometimes somebody hears the word atheist and they, envision this sort of shrouded figure in the dark corner, right? Something like along those lines. And it's just not the lived reality. I have many very friendly, productive, engaged conversations with intelligent atheists who would go out of their way for me if I needed something. And there was one friend in particular over the 2 years that I was studying at Oxford, and he was on placement at the university by his country's government and lived with an atheist perspective. And for 2 years, we had conversations that were massively productive and helpful for me to understand where he was coming from. And he was one of my good friends during that time. And so I do think there can be misconceptions about the character of atheists, that there are people who aren't capable of living, that they all live amoral lives or don't have the capacity to live a meaningful life or something like that. That's just not true, and I think Christians definitely can mischaracterize atheists in that respect.
Yeah, I realize that you might be kind of surprised by that because I'm not even sure it fits necessarily as a misconception. It's just something that's kind of put at us all the time. But I also largely agree with Michael. We can have conversations about whether or not someone who thinks they're actively being skeptical and thinking critically is or not. But that's about the methodology and whether or not you come to the right conclusion. I'm pretty much in agreement, and not that I predicted this in the same way I predict other things on stage, but I fully expected that the most common misconception that you would think atheists have of Christians is the same one that I've observed. And it's the one I keep telling all my atheist friends. Somebody can be genuinely, sincerely wrong and not be a liar and not be an idiot. There are plenty of incredibly smart individuals who believe things that aren't true. And rather than beginning with the presumption that, Christianity is not true and Christians are wrong, therefore this person must be stupid, and they must have checked their brain at the door, if you're actually applying the principles of skepticism, you're going to go into it not with a foregone conclusion about what the truth is, but with a willingness to evaluate the claims and the reasons why. Now, it may be that the person you're talking to is incredibly stupid, whether they're an atheist or a Christian. I mean, that's just true. There are people who don't think clearly. I don't think there are as many people who are incapable of thinking clearly as many of us would suppose. I think it's about teaching and giving people the tools to think as clearly as possible. This is why some of the best conversations I've had on stage and off stage and at my house have been with Christians or theists of some stripe, where we're trying to get to the bare bones of what is the point of divergence. I mean, we could do that in kind of a debate format. I won't right now, but it's like, I'm fairly confident. I've known Michael for, I don't know, a couple hours. Yep. I'm pretty sure that we would agree that he and I experience essentially a shared reality.
I can agree with that.
See, and yet there are things about this reality we don't agree on. And so sometimes you have to take a step back to the beginning to say, okay, here's where we agree. Let's keep going. Oh, here it is. Here's where we disagree. And then you might find that that's not where you disagree. It requires a more detailed conversation. And if you just begin by assuming that the atheist really secretly believes, or that the Christian really secretly doesn't, or that one of the two of us has had to check our brains at the door, you're not actually interested in the subject of the conversation. You're here to show that you think you're right, and you think that you're the smartest person in the room.
That's good. So,
you're not.
That's
I'm
the
not.
truth. So let's get to the easy questions now.
Yes.
What is the meaning and purpose of life? Why are we here? Who wants to go first?
I can start us off. I have been thinking about this question. As Matt said, we were sent the questions beforehand. I didn't think to record my thoughts then and compare them. I may take that tip and run with it. When I was thinking about how to answer this question, usually the way the question's phrased is, what is the meaning of life? And I think often when we try to conceive of that, we actually just envision what we think a meaningful life might look like or feel like. Instead of actually answering that question, we immediately apply something that we haven't maybe quite understood and try to conceive of how that plays out. And I think for most people, the way that would play out is in some form of happiness, an experience of joy, fulfillment and satisfaction would be a huge part of that. And I'm speaking from the Christian perspective and how the Christian worldview would answer this question. And in the Christian worldview, for every single man or woman, you are made in the image of God, in the essence of God, in the sense that you have rational and relational capacities that are unique and that reflect God's divine nature, sort of his fingerprint on you, so to speak, that you're made in his image. And that says something very profound about human beings, that we have really an infinite dignity to who we are, and that there's an incredible amount of potential in us as people made in God's image. And so the question is, what does the fulfillment of that potential look like? And I think it does look like something where you experience a deep level of satisfaction, that there is joy, that there is something shared in that picture. But I also think that when we think of joy and what makes us happy, that throughout life, our experience of joy or happiness and how we define that kind of changes. I don't know about you, when I was a kid, it wouldn't take much, probably, an ice cream cone, and I am over the moon, right? And maybe for some of you here, that's really still all it takes. And I kind of envy that outlook on life right now. I mean, that's when you're a child, it's an instant gratification of something. I mean, there's videos on YouTube, I'm sure, of children when they first try ice cream and you can see their shock of the sugar immediately, or the cold or something. But as we grow, that which we find joy in, or we look to find joy in, also changes. And it changes into things that have more depth or longevity. It's no longer Disneyland. It might be a certain kind of relationship or a certain kind of stability that you have in your life, a purpose in your work or something like that. And what that tells me is that in life, that there are multiple sort of levels of fulfillment. And as a Christian, when I talk about what is the meaning of life or what is a meaningful life, I think what I'm talking about is the fulfillment of the potential that every man or woman has, having been made in the image of God, and that the chief end of that really is relational. As a Christian also, when I think about a meaningful life, I would look to what I would say is the most meaningful life ever lived, the life of Jesus of Nazareth. And I think in him, we have an example of the priority of that relationship with our Creator, which he never stepped out of. And so I think that the meaning of life, if simply put, to sort of summarize kind of where I've been with all of this, is to say that it is really to know the God in whose image you've been made, to be known by your Creator intimately, and to enjoy him and live out that relationship practically with him, reflecting his glory back to him by serving other people the way that Jesus lived and served. That's as succinct maybe as I can put it. But I think the difference maybe, and forgive me, I don't know if I'm supposed to do this contrasting our worldviews at all, but as Os Guinness says, contrast is the mother of clarity. So I think it can be helpful. So is that there is if we're talking about fulfillment at different levels, if it's possible to have a relationship with your Creator, and I do believe it is, then there's a level of fulfillment that is greater that could be found if that level in fact exists. And I think the meaning of life as a Christian, therefore, has that higher level of fulfillment if God really is real and we can exist in relationship with him.
Very good. Matt, how would you answer the question?
There isn't one. Okay. So a good chunk of there was a lot in your comments that I think I could view as kind of applications of secular humanism, apart from the Jesus stuff and the God stuff. For me, this is a point of frustration, because I wasn't joking when I said there isn't one, although it's a kind of a cheap laugh line. I think that our thoughts about the meaning of life have been poisoned by religions and philosophies that give us the impression that some externally imposed meaning for our life. Like, the universe, as far as I can tell, doesn't care anything about me. I'm not the product of intentional design or creation. It's not like there's a goal to my life that's externally imposed. And because I am not convinced that there's a God or anybody who has this sort of plan or design for my life, I have to ask myself, okay, what do I do about that? What in the absence of, hey, there's a God telling me what my purpose is, what's my purpose? And the nice thing is that I get to define what the purpose of my life is going to be. Now, even if I were convinced that a God existed and had a purpose for me, I'm not convinced that I would care about what some external purpose for my life is. And this is a thing that I find very curious. If there are countries where there are arranged marriages, and there are places where your role in society is predetermined, I am the kind of person, and I think when I'm speaking largely to other ignorant Americans like me, sorry if you're watching from outside of our country, how would you feel if your parents decided, nope, this is what's going to be your job? Or if the government said, nope, this is going to be your role in society? Those are externally imposed roles and purposes. This is what you're going to do. We would rebel, and have rebelled, against that sort of imposition in almost every category, except for this notion about a grand meaning or purpose to life. And in that sense, people are like, yes, God has a purpose for my life. How wonderful. But I suspect that the thing that we think is wonderful about it is now we don't have to ponder the question anymore. That if we're convinced that there's some grand purpose that's externally imposed, because this doesn't necessarily affect what car I'm going to buy or where I'm going to invest my money, it is one of those huge questions that is very troubling to some people to ponder, like their own mortality. And so when religions offer what seems to be a satisfactory answer, we just accept it and move on, because there's not a great impact to that. And you can live a perfectly wonderful, useful, valuable life, living the sort of purpose that he's talking about, depending on how you go about it. And so for me, my life has whatever meaning and purpose that I place upon it. I get to have whatever goals I can within reason. I can't violate the laws of determinism. I can't flap my wings and fly. There are things that I can wish for that are just preposterous. But recognizing that I now get to take credit for my achievements and take responsibility for my failures, that is huge. And it frustrates me as a secular individual. Somebody survives a catastrophic plane crash, and it's a miracle. Well, what about all the people that died? Oh, well, we rushed you to the hospital and the doctors worked on you all night, and thank God you're alive. Why would you give credit to God? The doctors did all the work there. It seems to me that whether or not there is a God, everything that I see points me to the conclusion that I'm stuck on this rock in space, sharing space with other people. That my beliefs inform my actions have consequences for myself and for others, and their actions have consequences on me. And so it's in my best interest to work cooperatively. We know this from game theory, that it's better to cooperate than to conflict, and that we can work together towards a better world, because I don't see any sort of divine intervention to come in and fix our problems. Even if there was a God, it's like in many cases viewed as an absentee landlord. We've got to fix it. But if somebody came along and said, this is God's purpose for your life, I think my first response would be, okay, please explain to me why I should care what God's purpose for my life is. Why would a God even need me to have a purpose other than the purpose that I discover? and I can live a perfectly wonderful, fulfilled life. Atheists, non-believers can be charitable. We work with Austin Atheists Helping the Homeless and Humanists at Work. We donate to charities. We give our time for things. We're all interested in education to some extent. I have an obsession to know as many things as well as I can reasonably know them. For me, the meaning and purpose of my life is to get to understand this reality as best I can, and to have my internal model of reality match the facts of reality as best I can. And the truth is that sometimes reality is harsh. It may be the case that I have terminal cancer and don't know it. And I recognize that there are people who in that situation would not want to know. I am one of the people who would want to know. And I respect that variety of you getting to decide within limits how you're going to live your life. And yes, there are some lives that I would think are obviously more valuable than others in how people choose to live. And it's not just a matter of how charitable you are or anything else. How we interact with each other, the process of respecting individuals, when you realize that that tells you who you are and what path you're on, how you treat others. It's not, I don't need a golden rule, which, by the way, I think is really ill-formed in the New Testament and was formed better elsewhere. The ethics of reciprocity, the recognition that we have to share space. I don't need anything more. And if there was an externally imposed purpose, I don't think I would want it. I'm not confused at why people do. I'm just not the kind of person that would. And maybe that biases me, but I don't think anybody can deny that while I might not be living a life that glorifies Christ, I am living a decent, productive life and seeking knowledge and cooperating with people. And if that's not good enough for any person, I don't care. If it's not good enough for a God, I don't care. It's as good a goal as I can come up with.
So, wonderful answers and very consistent to what people have studied, and we appreciate those answers. According to the format we picked, this would be a great moment for you all to have a great discussion, but we're going to save that for later. So we want to just encourage you, if you are hearing something you want more explanation to, in a few moments, that'd be the great time to ask these two fellows. So, okay, it gets even more complicated.
Oh, good.
You have to go first on this one, Matt.
Okay. I will go first.
Evil and suffering. You know, when you think about just how terrible things have been historically and how many things there are that are so incredibly negative and hard to get our minds around in our present world, how does your worldview inform you? What is it you go to? How do you see the explanation of evil and suffering in the world we live in now?
Yeah, so I don't know if this will actually surprise Michael at all. I'm on record. So there is theodicy, the issue of the problem of evil and suffering, and it's often used as an argument against a particular type of God. I'm on record as saying I'm not remotely impressed by the argument from evil as an argument against. I think that there are flaws. I think that there are good responses. I think that you can go to something like, well, this is the best of all possible worlds type thing, and all of a sudden that resolves it. So I've never really relied on it. I understand that it's impactful. It is an emotional appeal to say, how on earth could there possibly be a loving God who lets parasites dig through the eyeballs of children? That's just bizarre. But I realize, having grown up in this, that there are a number of apologetics that smooth that over to some extent or another. When I look at the world, for me, evil and good are labels that we put on things with respect to our values and our goals. It's not like evil is something that exists in the world. The parasite that I mentioned isn't evil. It's not necessarily malicious in its intent. It's following the laws of nature, and it's just that it has this effect on us, and this is why we label it as evil. In much the same way that I think religions and some philosophies have kind of misled us on meaning, and this is going to become a trend, so get ready for the next question too. I think it's misinformed us on the nature of evil and suffering. The universe is not working towards your best interest, and it's not out to get you. despite the fact that the overwhelming majority of the universe is hostile to life. You can survive on this one tiny little portion of this one rock, and the vast majority, 99.99999% of everything else in the universe, you would die, just as a matter of fact. If you begin with the assumption that there should be fairness, that there should be justice, as if it's imposed externally, if it's not something that we create, you are going to be disappointed. With or without a God, the facts of reality are that good things happen to bad people and bad things happen to good people, and that some people get away with things, and that some people are what we would call evil, that there's something about them that where they intend to do harm, where they are selfish in a destructive sense. Maybe at some other point we can talk about selfishness in a good sense, because I think you can get to an altruistic position through selfishness as a matter of practicality. But there are people out there that do bad things. The problem of evil, as the argument, is that it needs to be rephrased as the problem of excessive evil, like why does there need to be this much suffering? And I don't know that there's a good solution to this. I know it's something that troubles a lot of people. But from my point of view, if I don't begin with the notion that there should exist fairness and justice without effort, if I toss that out, then I immediately get to realize the universe isn't out to get me. The universe isn't out to help me. It's up to me. If I want there to be justice in the world, I need to build an understanding and teach people and cooperate with other people to impose justice on this world. If I want the things to be fair, then I have to take those same steps to try to get the world to be as fair as possible. If I want to ease suffering, I can't just sit around and wait for the karmic wheel to turn or for some divine being to intervene and stop world hunger. I actually need to be proactive. I need to work with the other people that I'm sharing space with to build a better world. It's on us. This is the principal foundation of secular humanism. Irrespective of whether or not there is a God, all the evidence points to the fact that it is up to us to build the world that is not evil, that is not infused with suffering. Because I don't see anybody else doing anything about it. And I think it's the idea that we somehow are deserving of justice and mercy and a lack of suffering without effort, without direct effort on our part, that is framing this in a way where people are like, oh my gosh, how could a loving God let this happen? I agree, that's problematic. How could a loving God allow my child to die? And my apologies to anybody who has been through that traumatic experience. It's the most common example. I understand how that can frustrate people into not believing that there's a God, but my disbelief or my rejection of the claim that there's a God isn't based on the fact that bad things happen and therefore, let me shake my fist at a God. It's based on a lack of evidence and a lack of reason for it. And so I deal with the notion of evil and suffering by recognizing that I'm not entitled to anything. I need to earn what I have. That cooperation is a better way to live most of the time. Doesn't mean I'm not going to get angry and flip somebody off on the highway or whatever. And that these frustrations that enter our lives are our issues to solve. And that if we seek comfort in areas where we don't necessarily have a good reason to think that comfort is going to come, and I don't mean this to belittle or diminish things, this is not an argument against God, but if you think you have lucky socks, and you think that there's a God, and that one of those two is going to make your life better, I think you've made an error, irrespective of whether those socks exist or God exists or luck or anything else. It's up to us.
Can you just repeat the question for me one more time?
Yes.
Thanks.
Suffering and evil in our world. How does a Christian worldview deal with the concept? How do you get your head around that? How do you understand that from a Christian worldview? Why is it so?
Thank you for repeating that. So foundational to the Christian worldview is that the world as we observe it currently is not how it was initially created. That's foundational to the Christian worldview, that there was the initial creation of the world was in such a way that the kinds of evil and suffering that exists are, that they are a product of a relationship being broken vertically, horizontally, and also between the inhabitants of the earth and the earth itself. And so that's foundational to the Christian worldview. I also think that, as a Christian, I look at the world and it is undeniable to me that there are instances of demonstrable, undeniable, categorical, absolute evil. And the Christian worldview having, obviously, when you believe in the God, you believe in the transcendence. When you believe in transcendence, you believe in absolutes. And there are instances in our world that I believe are categorically evil. I don't know that I would include parasites, although that sounds absolutely horrific. But there are, I think, the most atrocious things that have happened in human history have been things that we have done to one another. And I think it affects us in a particular way because while simultaneously we seem to have capacities for atrocious, horrendous evils, we also have a deep-seated longing for justice. That's a competing, incongruent thing about the state of human beings presently. And when I look at the world and I think about suffering, anybody who points to an instance of suffering is doing so in an objection, in almost every case, that it shouldn't be that way. And even Jesus, in his response to his friend Lazarus' death, when Lazarus dies, he grieves. And in the text, it specifically says he wept. And if you look at the text in depth, it's a kind of weeping that includes an outcry that this is not the way it was supposed to be. Death was not intended for humans to experience. And we even see in Jesus a lamenting of that reality. But I think that what's so unique, maybe two things I would say about this is that, one, I think the Christian worldview is unique in the kind of hope that it provides with people who really are enduring horrific suffering. There are instances of suffering in this world that people will never escape until the day that they die. And I have seen things, it was while I was in India, and it's not exclusive to India, so I don't want to, throw the nation of India, make an example of India. It's not that. But I have seen instances of people who will be enslaved until they die, and they will die young. And it's something like that. For that person, my question would be, what kind of hope could ever exist for that person? And I think Christianity is unique in that if Jesus really is who he claimed to be, and if he really was raised from the dead, then what that suggests is that death is not the end, and that there really is a hope beyond death. Now, that doesn't make it true. Just because it's helpful doesn't make it true. But just because it's helpful doesn't make it false either. We have to ask other questions about the evidence and the truth of the Christian faith. But assuming that Christianity is true, I think it's unique in the kind of hope that it provides, because in Christianity, death is not the end. In fact, death is actually, as Paul said it, to live is Christ and to die is gain. In other words, to live is to serve and reflect the life and love that Jesus embodied, and to die is just to be reunited with him again. And I think that in the Christian worldview, there's an immense amount of hope for people despite anything that they may be facing. And I think we live in a world that desperately needs hope. And with respect to justice, if there is no God, if God doesn't exist, then the only justice that can occur is in this life. I don't know about you, but I'm not very confident in our justice system currently. I don't know how you feel about that. I live in Washington, D.C. I think we all know that there are some problems in our justice system at various levels. If that's all there is, then we've got major work to do. I think Matt would probably agree with that. But in the Christian worldview, when it comes to suffering, there will be justice. And the final point that I'd make just very briefly is that God has not left us alone in our suffering. And this is the most, maybe one of the most unique things about the God of the Bible, is that there is no other God in philosophy or religion who enters in to a world he has created, that the beings that inhabit that world have so deeply affected, and then makes himself subject. He not only suffers with us, he ultimately suffers for us. And I think as people, we tend to trust people who have skin in the game. right? I don't know about you, but I trust somebody if they've got something on the line. And in Jesus, the God of the Bible has skin in the game. And he's the only God with scars. And those scars testify to a reason that he came and he gave his life and he traded his son's life for ours. Now, Jesus overcame that death, and that's why we have the hope that we have. But I think that Christian vision for suffering that transcends any circumstance provides hope and has provided hope historically for many people when facing some of the most atrocious evils that our human civilization has ever seen.
Amen. Thank you, Michael. So, isn't it good to be here? It's good to hear these guys in such a peaceful, educational kind of way, and I, for one, am very appreciative for the answers you all are sharing tonight. Before we go to the floor and allow folks to ask their questions, I want to ask you one last question, and I'm going to read this because I want to get it exactly right.
I think in fairness, I should probably go first. That way you get the last word before questions.
I am not going to object to that.
Okay.
Go for it.
All right.
There's that fairness we have to impose upon ourselves.
Absolutely. So what is your belief on the afterlife, and how does that belief affect or speak to your life in the present? What is your view of the afterlife, and how does that belief affect or speak to your life in the present?
Yeah, this is the part where I never seek to offend or hurt people, but I always seek to be honest. So somebody's going to be very bothered by some things that I'm going to say. All of these questions, they kind of dovetail off each other. What's meaning and purpose? How do you deal with suffering? And then what's this afterlife thing? And at the end of Michael's last response, he was talking about if there can only be justice in this life, that's just, wow, we really need justice in another life. Well, first of all, I'm not convinced that there is or could be another life. As a matter of fact, I've said that the very notion of a soul or something that is me, that survives my death, is the most obviously dead concept in all of theology. It's something that, to the extent that we can reasonably be convinced that a theological construct is not true, this is the one. From what we know about who we are, from what we know about brains, and I'll get into some of that in a minute. But to dovetail off the last one, I think that this appeal of the afterlife is for the exact reason that he stated. Oh, you're not going to get justice in this world, but there'll be justice in the next world. No, there won't. No, there won't. This notion of mercy is in direct conflict with justice. Justice is getting what you deserve. Mercy is getting something you don't deserve. And so if there is a God that is going to be merciful, that is going to forgive your sins, then you are getting something that you don't deserve. And if he's going to do it on the basis of a really bad weekend where you can kill me right now, you can bruise my body, chop me up into pieces, and let me stay dead forever if I have an absolute guarantee that it will end suffering in the world, right now. And that's a greater sacrifice than giving up a weekend and then getting to be co-equal with God for all of eternity. And I don't mean that to be insulting. I'm just looking at this as a practical matter. Oh, it was a great sacrifice. I don't see it as a sacrifice. I don't even see it as a reason. If there's a God who can create, and he can create people, and he knows who's going to get up, who knows who's going to end up in heaven, why not create all those people in heaven to begin with and not create all the other people who are going to be damned? There are real, serious problems with the doctrine. But if we're just talking about whether or not there's an afterlife, not only do I not see evidence for an afterlife, I see massive amounts of evidence against an afterlife, against the notion of a soul. We know from studying people who have had damaged brains or hemispherectomies that you can fundamentally change everything about a person. There are people who have their memories reset. There are people who have their personalities fundamentally changed. In split brain patients, you can go up and look at a study V.S. Ramachandran did, where there was one individual that had the corpus callosum severed, and that results in two distinct independent people, personalities, in one brain communicating independently. One of them has access to speak. The other one has access to write using either the left or right hand. I can't ever get the brain thing sorted on that. One of them still a Christian, one of them an atheist. Now, this is one person we're talking about here with two distinct personalities communicating independently, able to answer questions independently. You can see this, phantom limb syndromes and other things that are really cool about the brain. But if everything about me, what I like, my preferences, my personality, whether or not I'm saved, is something that is malleable in the brain, then the idea of a ghost in the machine or a spirit guiding the machine or a spirit driving the machine, this Cartesian theater of the mind, is absolutely false. Because two people in the front row, one of them, their soul, is the ghost in the machine and is running their life. And the other one has suffered brain damage such that the soul is no longer piloting the vessel. They both start off as Christians. One of them is an atheist because of this brain damage, which is convenient. All my Christian friends can use the atheist or brain damage argument. But you can't tell the difference between them. And what you have is a soul that was saved that is now stuck, glommed on in almost a Scientology fashion to a body that is running around doing things. Maybe it's running around sinning. Maybe it's running around engaged in charitable efforts. And there's a disconnect there. Nothing about the soul makes sense. That's not to say that I can prove it doesn't exist. But when we talk about what makes me me, all of the best evidence points to the unavoidable conclusion that I will cease to exist. Our fear of death is more about what it's like to be dead. And I think that if we began by teaching people that death is a seemingly inevitable result of being alive, and that you don't experience death because there's no you left, as far as we can tell, that would go a lot to easing grief and letting people deal with each other better to begin with. Because if there is an afterlife, doesn't seem to be any way for me to tell that. There doesn't seem to be any way for me to do anything about it. It will be a surprise to me. It will be a bonus, a good one or a bad one, I don't know. I can't do anything if there's a God that wants to punish me forever for actually just not believing. That's that God's prerogative. I can't do anything about it, but I'll spend eternity in hell knowing that I'm morally superior to the thug that sent me there. That's the part that's probably going to irritate some people. The thing is, how it fundamentally changes my life is I don't ever get to live as if justice can come in a next life. I don't ever get to live as if I can make up with you. If I'm estranged from my father and we don't speak anymore and he dies, I don't get to say, oh, well, it'll all be okay in heaven. I have to work now with the one and only life that I'm sure that I'm going to get to make that the best life and to make sure that my interactions with other people are not contingent on possibly being repaired in another life that I don't know I'll get. I've got to do it now. It's up to me now. That's why my answer for the last three questions is essentially the same. I don't see evidence for it. I see evidence against it. And even if it were true, I don't know that it would change the best way to act in this life. Because if we comfort ourselves with the notion that, well, if there's not going to be justice in this life, at least it's going to come in the next life, maybe? Does that stop us from seeking justice here? Does it halt progress? I think it can, and I think it has. And I think if you begin with a recognition that as far as I know, I'm going to die. As far as I know, that's the end. As far as I know, I got one life. You do not, as some people claim, end up advocating a purely hedonistic life of let me eat, drink, and be merry and run roughshod across the earth. That's not where you end up. Because if you live your life that way, your life is going to be short, nobody's going to like you, you have to share space with people. Recognizing that we must cooperate, recognizing that this is one life fundamentally changes how I live it. And I think that it makes how I live my life better.
Thank you, Matt. Michael?
So, when we're talking about the afterlife, and there's a second part of that question as well about how that affects how we live in the present. And, I think Matt's criticism is something that I would also criticize. I think if for any Christian believer who says, oh, because justice exists in eternity, then somehow I need to check out from certain responsibilities or moral obligations in my life today. That's not what it means to live with an eternal perspective. To live with an eternal perspective is not to check out of this life and lean heavily on all the things that God will do, because you don't have to take responsibility anymore. That's his business. What it means is to understand that Jesus came to inaugurate a kingdom that doesn't just begin after you die. Salvation is something that has happened, is happening, and will happen for anyone who puts their trust in Jesus as a Savior. And to live with an eternal perspective is to participate. We talk about civic participation in the United States, and I think actually the United States would massively benefit from more civic participation, more civil discourse, and things like that. Similarly, speaking about the kingdom of God, we need civic participation in the kingdom. And anyone who claims to be a believer understands, or if you look at the Bible and read it seriously, can understand that there is an invitation to be part of that in the present. It's not just something that happens after we die. Eternal life begins in the present, and it continues into the afterlife. And so that's maybe one important clarification. And also, when it comes to the afterlife, I think Matt is right to pick up on the idea that this involves some concept of some supernatural or eternal part of human beings. I think that the biblical word, the word that I would use would be the spirit, the human spirit. The Bible is not incredibly clear on what that is. It says in Genesis 2 that God created man out of the dust. He breathed into his nostrils, and he became a living creature. And then there are later references in the Bible to that event. The closest one to what I think a spirit might be is that when it comes to the natural sciences or cognitive sciences, one of the massive debates and discussions is the consciousness question. What is it? Where does it come from? And it's very hard to articulate an answer to that question, and I don't think anybody is intellectually deficient if they can't answer that clear. It's massively mystifying, and I agree with you. That's the case. But what it says in Scripture, in I think it's in Job 32, and it says that it is the spirit of man, the breath of the Almighty, that gives him understanding. That there's something, my understanding, just based on reading Scripture and the other references that exist, is that consciousness as we experience it is part of being a living creature. It is part of the spirit that we possess. And I think that part of us is significant, and I think it's that there's an eternal part of that goes on even after the physical body dies. That your consciousness might leave the body, but that consciousness that your body possessed somehow continues. Can I explain that? Not entirely. Does that mean that it's wrong? I don't really know. I know what I believe, but can I prove it to you empirically? No, I can't. It is part of the Christian worldview, and I think it's consistent with the Christian worldview. I think it's consistent with what it means to be alive. And again, I would point to the image of God as a concept that allows for the human spirit to exist. So when we talk about how a view of eternity, or the fact that there is an eternal destiny, that should have a bearing on a Christian's life. That should make a difference because of what we understand about what we've been invited into. And when you look historically at the world, I think Christianity has done a remarkable job, actually. There are definitely moments of weakness. And I think anybody who's a Christian here can admit and concede to the fact that some horrific things have been done in the name of God and Christianity. There's no doubt about it. There have been many lives that have been lost in the name of God or Christianity. I think Jesus clearly undermines that idea when he's being arrested and a sword is pulled and cut off the ear of a soldier. Jesus automatically says, no, put the sword away. He heals the ear. When he's in front of Pilate, he says, if my kingdom were of this world, my followers would be taking up a sword to defend me. I think that's out of the character of the kingdom of God to be doing that type of thing. But when you look at history, is Christianity a force for good in the world? Unquestionably, yes, it has been. Even when you look in the United States, I don't know if it's just the United States. I think it is in the United States. 106 of the first 108 universities founded in the United States for higher education were founded as Christian. Some kind of Christian ethos was part of the institution. If you look at the advance of women in other countries, for example, bride burning in India was a huge thing. It was Christians who took an initiative to end that practice. It was Christians who took the initiative to end foot binding in China. It was Christians who took the initiative initially to start orphanages. actually nuns and monks who started serving the poor, making leper colonies, taking in the sick and the diseased, which became the hospitals. It's why the Catholic Church to date has such a vast influence on the medical world and hospitals, because its inception was with the church. I could go on. I could talk about the sciences and how the rise of modern science actually is a result of thinking men believing in God, looking for the order in the universe that they assumed would be there because he created it that way. And the list goes on. I think that Christians and people who believe in God have made massive contributions to Western society. I think that continues in the Eastern world. And I think that Christians should be proud to be part of that history, and that they continue to actively serve and seek to serve their neighbor, and that's the kind of kingdom that we live to represent. And you know, for those of you who have experienced something other than that, somebody who has checked out until the day they die, I'm sorry, that is not a good representation of what it means to be part of an eternal kingdom that begins in the present. And so, do I believe in the afterlife? Yes. Do I believe in God and the supernatural? Yes. Do I believe in justice that happens, and that we live in a moral universe, a moral cosmos, and that those scales will be settled? Yes, I do. But I believe that on the basis of evidence and a cumulative case that I think is very compelling for the existence of God and the truth of the Christian faith.
Thank you so much. Well, I think this has been civilized, don't you? It's great to hear the views of an atheist worldview, a Christian worldview, in such a engaging kind of way. And I think we should thank these two, Matt and Michael, for their answers.
This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.